Well, I'm thrilled. I've really been looking forward to this. I've been very excited about the class today, and really glad that you all could be with us. Um, I can't say it was in a dream, but I think I had woken up and was still laying in bed, and it came to me that it would be really good to do a very quick review of the Old Testament, and I'm talking about very high level. I call it Old Testament from 30,000 feet. And the reason is when you pick up the book of Luke, and we're in the book of Luke, we start right in with the birth of John the Baptist, and we can easily ask, well, why is that even significant? And there's so much in the Old Testament that brings us up to and points to the opening of the book of Luke, and particularly the birth of John and then the birth of Jesus. So, and the other thing I wanted to say, you may have questions that come up. If you could maybe take a piece of paper, or Joe, if anybody needs like a piece of paper, and just jot down, a name or a question or whatever, and either Joe or I or both of us will get you more information on that. If you have email, we can email it to you. If not, I'll email it to Joe. He can print it out, bring it around to you. So to me, that really makes the study of the Bible fascinating when we can learn more about things like who was Herod, what was his background, why was he so intent on killing, Jesus, those kinds of things that really bring out the story. So hang with me. It's going to be a fast move through the Old Testament. And then at the end of this, I'll wait and we can discuss any questions that you have right away that I may cover. So we'll go to that first slide. I call it the Old Testament from 30,000 feet. That's not original, but we'll use it. Uh, if you've read the Bible at all, you'd be familiar with the creation as told in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice there's no explanation, there's nothing trying to prove the existence of God. It just matter of factly says, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. We then remember that the crowning creation of God was Adam and Eve, the first man, and then the woman that was made, we're told, out of some part. Many versions of the Bible say a rib of Adam. And they were placed in a perfect environment, really a paradise. Everything they had was provided for them, the food, everything. Uh, they communed with God. God would come among them and they would have conversations. And remember, in that Garden of Eden or peaceful garden, there were really a couple of commands. God told them to tend the garden, meaning to work it. He also told them that they could eat of a fruit of the tree of life, but not of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. So in essence, in the very first situation with Adam and Eve, there were positive commands and negative. And as we know, Eve and then Adam ate of that forbidden fruit, that tree of knowledge of good and evil. Their eyes were opened, and God expelled them from that
That's
garden.
okay.
So now we're at the point where Adam and Eve, and this is really key. Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden and from Jesus and from God's presence. And really, you can think of the entire rest of the Bible as revealing the method or the manner in which mankind can get back into the presence of God. That's one of those threads that you can hang on onto the entire Bible. After the fall of man, mankind, began to multiply as more and more children were born. And at some point, and we don't know the exact point, mankind had become so evil that God determined to destroy the earth. There was one man by the name of Noah, and we're simply told that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And God commanded Noah to build a gigantic boat, often referred to as an ark. It was really more like a box, huge box. And then we're talking large box. and to put all of different kinds of animals on that ark and get ready because God was going to destroy that world by flood. That flood water, by the way, just as a matter of curiosity, lasted over a year from the time it started raining. It took a long time for the water to go down. And in the ark, Noah, his wife, three sons, and their wives became the ones who were saved in the ark. It was by their faith that they were saved. In other words, they believed God when he told them it was coming. It had never been anything like that. Noah built that ark over a very long time while people ridiculed him. And then the rain started and they got in the ark and were saved. Now we're going to fast forward to a man named Abraham. He was a descendant, of course, of Noah. In fact, everybody on the earth today is a descendant of Noah and or his three sons. Um, so Abraham was a descendant of Noah, and we're told that he believed God, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned as righteousness. That word means literally counted for righteousness or credited to him. Abraham was living in the Euphrates River Valley, where we would think of as the early Sumerian population, down at the lower end of the Euphrates River, which is part of Iraq today. In fact, that's part of the area that we fought a war against Saddam Hussein in 1990 and 91. Abraham lived in a land of idolatry. They worshiped many other gods. And Abraham was told by God to get up, take his family, and simply go to a place that God would show him. Abraham did that. He traveled for many weeks and years, really, until he finally got to the land of what was then called Canaan, not Canaan, which is part of modern day Israel today. We'll show that on a map in a moment. Now, very important to kind of get this. The reason Abraham is so important is God gave, we're talking, he lived about 2,000 years before Christ, about 2 millennia. God gave him three promises, and they were unconditional. It didn't depend on Abraham's further actions. It was a covenant that God made with Abraham. God told Abraham that he would give him the land that he walked over, which was the land of Canaan and north and south of that he would make Abraham a great nation, and that nation becomes the Jewish nation. And the third thing he told Abraham was the entire world would be blessed through Abraham's descendants. And so we're going to see that Christ comes directly down the line from Abraham. And it is through Jesus that the entire world is blessed or capable of being blessed. So this is one of the frameworks that you can understand the entire Old Testament. It's now the telling of how those promises to Abraham are going to be fulfilled. The Old Testament has history in it, but it's not designed to be like world history. It's really designed to be the history of God's people from Abraham right on down through Christ, okay? Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac was given the same promises that Abraham was given. And then Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau, they were twins actually. Esau came out of the womb first, and under that law would have been considered the firstborn. However, God gave the birthright and the blessing to the second son, Jacob. And that created disputes and hatred and enmity between the two sons, really from that time on. Jacob, and this is key, was later named Israel, means God wrestled with Jacob. But the name Israel became the most common name for Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons through four different women. And those 12 sons of Israel became the children of Israel and the fathers of the 12 tribes of the Jewish nation. Very important. So that one promise of Abraham being a great nation has now started. Now, around about 1900 years BC, uh, I'm sorry, roughly 1800 BC, we believe that Jacob and his family, only about 70 people, went down into Egypt. Now, the story of how they got there is the story of Joseph, one of the younger sons of Jacob or of Israel, who was sold into slavery in Egypt. This is in the later chapters of the book of Genesis. So Joseph goes into Egypt first, becomes very prominent because he was faithful to God, and was basically elevated to the second in command from the Pharaoh himself. Jacob had interpreted dreams and told Pharaoh there would be a great famine for 7 years after 7 years of bountiful progress in crops. So during that first 7 years, they stored up a great deal of the crops in huge bins, which have even been excavated today in Egypt. And then during the 7 famine years, they used that storage to feed the people, and people from all over that area came down into Egypt to buy grain. So here, God's hand was always in this. God had them placed in a position in the northern part of Egypt that was protected from enemies. And so, for roughly 350 to 400 years, the children of Israel grew and grew to what many Bible scholars feel was at least 1.5 million to 2 million people. I want you to imagine that. On a good day in a football game, you might have 100,000 people in the stadium. Multiply that by 15 or 20, and that's an approximate number of the Jews that will come out of Egypt under the direction and leadership of Moses. Just as an aside, the date of that delivery out of Egypt is still debated. There's the early date of around 1500 to 1400 BC. There's the later date of around 1450, which I personally think was about right, where Moses led the children out of the land of Israel, land of Egypt. So we talked about Joseph, we talked about the nation of Israel, and then they're delivered by Moses. The book of Exodus, Numbers, and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy all relate to the exit from Egypt and the traveling to the land of Canaan, which remember had been promised to Abraham by God back in around 2000 BC. About a year after they got out of Egypt, within that first year, the law of Moses was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. He went up on a sharp mountain. The people were camped at the base of the mountain, and God gave the law of Moses written on stone tablets to Moses. Now, Moses came down from the mountain. The children of Israel had already started some idolatrous dancing and so on. It angered Moses, and he broke them. If you ever saw the movie Moses back in the 50s, that scene is prominent in there. And then another set of those tablets was given to Moses, the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments was only a part of the law of Moses. Scholars have noted something like 300 different principles or commandments, both positive and negative, in the law of Moses, having to do with what to eat, what not to eat, what to sacrifice, what not to sacrifice. One of the most important aspects of the law of Moses is the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was considered where God dwelt among his people. And in fact, the word tabernacle in Hebrew literally means dwelling or house. It's often translated as booth. And Jews today even celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles or booths. And in modern day Israel, they'll go in their backyard, put up a tent or shed of some kind, and stay outside for several days. I want to, if you would, Joe, put up the next slide. It's so important to understand basically what this tabernacle looked like. This is an artist sketch of it, and this was a portable structure. It could be taken down and put on carts drawn by oxen, or and much of it would be carried by the priest, which I'll explain in a moment. But notice there's an outside wall that's a cloth wall that's put up and down. You have staves made of bronze that hold that cloth up. Only the priests, which were descendants of Aaron, and who was Aaron? It was Moses's brother, and Aaron became the first high priest, and then his descendants later became priests, and they had the duties of the tabernacle. Looking ahead in Luke, the first chapter, we're going to see Zacharias. He's a priest from the order of Aaron, and he's doing his duty in the temple in Jerusalem when that angel appeared to him. So this is why it all fits together, okay? Now, only priests could go inside the area enclosed by the walls. The first thing you see there is a large bronze altar, and that's where the priest would burn animal sacrifices and grain sacrifices for the people. So, for example, when someone sinned, they would bring an animal to the priest. It had to be a perfect animal, very often a sheep, a goat, or a young bull. The person bringing the sheep would kill it. It would slit its throat. They would drain the blood out of the sheep or the goat. They would cut it into pieces, and it would be the priest who would burn this animal upon the sacrifice. Key here is to understand for hundreds of years, this drilled into the Jews that when a sin occurred, it was going to take the blood of in their case, bulls and goats to stave off the anger of God. Obviously, that is pointing toward Jesus Christ and his blood sacrifice up on the cross. It's a figure or pointing toward that to come. The next thing you see beyond the bronze altar is a basin. It's a wash basin. And this is where the priest would wash their hands, arms, and get ready to go into the main part of the tabernacle. Now you see the part that's covered by actually sheepskin or skins of various sorts. This is the most holy part of the tabernacle. Can you give the next slide, please? Okay, this is where we're going into the holy part of the tabernacle. On the left side, the far left side, there's a curtain, again, which only priests could go through. It was a very elaborate curtain. And when you went in through or under that curtain or to the side of it, you came into what was called the holy place. On the right is a table of loaves of bread. There were 12 loaves of bread that were replaced every Sabbath day. They're unleavened bread, and they're made according to a strict rule that God laid down. Only the priests were supposed to eat the bread. As they put in new bread on the Sabbath, they were able to eat. The priests were able to eat the old loaves. To the left side is an elaborate candlestick. It's really more of a holder of lamps. There were lamps that were lit with oil, and they were burned continuously while the tabernacle was set up. And priests had to go in there during the day and keep those lamps, all of those 7 lamps, burning brightly. Today, Jews still use the symbol of that candlestick as a symbol for their national identity. The next little thing is a small altar to right in the middle of the page where your cursor is. This is only about 3 feet high and about square on the top of about 1.5 by 1.5 feet. This is called the altar of incense. Incense was a combination of things like frankincense and gum and other things. Recipe was given by God how to make it, and it was only to be used in this holy function here. The priest would go in there twice a day, and they would put some of that incense on that altar. They would get the fire from the big altar that was out in the courtyard. So they would light a fire in this little altar, burn the incense, and this was considered to be the prayers of the people going up in smoke to be answered by God. Now, past that altar is another elaborate curtain, and it was given in minute detail how to make it, the purple, red, crimson. So only the high priest, which started out to be Aaron, could go inside that area, and it's called the most holy place. You see a light kind of descending onto the box. That box is called the Ark of the Covenant. And if you've watched any movies like Searching for the Lost Ark, that's what they're still looking for. And there are a lot of myths and stories about where that is today. This was a wooden box, basically, covered with pure gold, and inside there at various times was a copy or were the stones of the Ten Commandments. There was a rod of Aaron that miraculously had budded at one point, and there was a pot of manna, which was a substance that God gave the children of Israel while they were wandering through the wilderness. So once again, the high priest only went in that area one time a year to offer sacrifices for the entire nation of Israel. It was called on the Day of Atonement. There would be multiple sacrifices out in the courtyard at the altar, and then he would take blood of some of the animals, sprinkle it all over that area, and again atone for the children of Israel for that year. Okay, back to the next slide, please. And it's a copy of the one before. So very important. That tabernacle is going to represent the presence of God. And the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament gives chapter after chapter using the tabernacle as representing the presence of God and Jesus Christ being our high priest who went into God's presence once and for all times as a one-time sacrifice for our sins. Unlike the Jews of old, he only had to do that one time. Now, it was only a matter of weeks if you walked straight from Egypt to Canaan, but the children of Israel did not believe God, and you may have heard the story. Moses sent 12 spies to spy out Canaan. 10 of them came back and said, "Oh, they're monsters. There's giants in there. We can't take them." Two of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, "Oh no, we can go in there. We can take them." But the people believed the 10 spies, the unfaithful ones, and the punishment was a wandering of nearly 40 more years, where the older generation died out in the desert. Thousands per day died over that 40 years. Moses was unable by God to lead the children into Canaan, and a man named Joshua, a great leader, took them in, and I believe it was around 1450 BC. I'm not dogmatic on that, but my study of it, that's where I've come to land on. Now, they came into Canaan, they had to take conquest of the land. They had to defeat the idolatrous and just awful people that were living in there, collectively called the Canaanite people. And it took, decades in some cases to defeat them. And in fact, they did not defeat them totally as God had told them to do. Now, just as a word there, some of these Canaanite nations practiced child sacrifice, burning children on their altars. God had given them over 700 years minimum to repent, and they had not done so. And so God used Joshua and the children of Israel to defeat these nations, and in many cases, to wipe them out completely. Now, the land of Canaan was divided up into the 12 tribes by lot and by the size of the tribes. The tribe of Judah was a very large one, and it got quite a large part of land. After Joshua died, the Jews began going off into idolatry, and you entered a period of judges, people like Deborah, the woman judge, Samson, who had supernatural strength, Samuel, and so on, would come in, lead the people back. They would repent. God would bless them for another 40, 50 years, and then the next generation would go off into idolatry, and the same thing repeated itself for some roughly 400 years. In about 1000 BC, the people with the Samuel being the last judge, Samuel was getting old. His boys were not good people, and the people of Israel clamored for and demanded a king over them, whereas God had been their king with the judges as sort of administrators. Uh, the people demanded a king to be like the nations around them. Samuel was very displeased with this, but God told him it wasn't a rejection of him, and God basically allowed Samuel to anoint a man named Saul as the first king of the United Kingdom of Israel. He was a mighty man at first. He won a lot of victories. He was very popular. Unfortunately, he disobeyed God in many aspects, and God rejected him and his lineage. So his son Jonathan did not become the king. David, who was described as a man after God's own heart, became the king after Saul and started his line of kings, which was Solomon. David was a mighty warrior, brought peace and prosperity, and kind of gave it over to Solomon. Solomon had very few problems in terms of enemies and so on, and so he built the kingdom up into elaborate and a rich kingdom that brought in people from all over the known world just to see how rich he was and how wise he was. Unfortunately, Solomon disobeyed God in many areas. He married many, many women, had many concubines or kind of unofficial wives, and then gave over to actually supporting them in their idolatry. As a result, God told David that Solomon's uh, would be king. But after Solomon got in there and began to depart, Solomon was not, taken out immediately, but at his death, his kingdom was divided into two parts. Very important. 10 of the tribes were the northern tribes in this land of Canaan. They were led initially by a king named Jeroboam, who had revolted against the United Kingdom. The lower part, which was only two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, was led by Rehoboam, which was the son of Solomon. So now you've got a divided kingdom: Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Bottom line is Israel in the north, while it took the name of Israel, none of its kings were good people. They were all evil. One of the worst was a man named Ahab with his beautiful wife Jezebel, which you've probably heard of. You don't see a lot of young girls named Jezebel today. She was a case. She brought the worship of Baal, or Baal, as Southerners pronounce it, into Israel, and really led the people into gross idolatry. Israel, meaning the 10 tribes in the north, were eventually defeated totally by the nation of Assyria in 722 BC. That's 700 years before Christ. Judah in the south did have some kings that led them into reform. And so Judah in the south lasted a bit longer, but it eventually was led into idolatry and other sins, and they were taken captive by the rising nation of Babylonia, ultimately in 686 BC. Now, in this captivity, it lasted basically 70 years. This is where you have the accounts of Daniel, remember, being in the lion's den, Ezekiel being a prophet. All of that occurred during that Babylonian captivity. Next slide, please. Um, the remnant of Jews, and we're only talking 45 to 50,000 of Jews, were allowed to return into Palestine in the area around Jerusalem in 536 BC by a man named Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, just a little note there: that man, that king, was prophesied by name, as with the word Cyrus, as the one who would deliver some of these people and allow them and aid them and assist them to come back into the area around Jerusalem. That started around 536 BC. It wasn't instantaneous, but it occurred, over some time. Here's where you have Ezra, who was kind of a governor. He was also a prophet. He was a governor of the Jews who had come back into Jerusalem. Nehemiah was a great Jewish leader who helped to rebuild the walls which had been destroyed during the Babylonian defeat of the nation of the city of Jerusalem. And then you have some of those later prophets that come in and prophesy, even as that remnant of people um, eventually go into, I would call it laziness and just an appearance, a hypocritical appearance of worship. Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, was written in roughly 450 BC, so 4 centuries before Christ. And the last verses of Malachi, I want to read because this helps us understand what's happening with John the Baptist. So this last book of the Bible, Malachi, was written to this remnant of Jews who had come back in from the Babylonian captivity roughly 200 years prior. And so the last verses says, behold, well, verse 4, remember the law of Moses, my servant, even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb, which is Mount Sinai for all Israel. Verse 5, behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. And he, notice it's a person, will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the land with a curse. We learn without question that John the Baptist is this he's not a reincarnation of Elijah, but he comes in the spirit and the appearance of Elijah. Elijah was a prophet that was sent into northern Israel at around 850 BC. He was a rough man. He lived out in the wilderness. He wore a robe of camel skin. He ate rough food. John the Baptist, in many ways, is very much similar to this Elijah. Now, here's a point to continue because all this will come together in the study of Luke. Many of the Pharisees, which was a very strict sect of the Jews, expected the real Elijah to come back because the real Elijah did not die a normal death. The real Elijah was taken directly up into heaven in a whirlwind, and his successor Elisha took his place as the prophet at that time. So the Pharisees literally believed that the original Elijah would come down, and when they asked him, John the Baptist, "Are you Elijah?" John the Baptist says, "No," meaning I'm not Elijah in the flesh. I'm not that prophet who actually, rose up into heaven back 800 years ago. Now, Malachi closes out the Old Testament, but that was not the end of history. A lot was going on in that 400 years. We call that the 400 years of silence between the last book of the Old Testament and the coming of Jesus and John the Baptist, as we're going to study in Luke. One of the biggest things that occurred was the rise of Alexander the Great. Now, that's a great topic, too. There's tremendous videos on his life and what he did. He was an amazing man. He was raised in Macedonia, which is north of Greece. He was raised as a man of war, learning to fight very early, and he literally conquered the great Persian Empire that had been in force for roughly 250 years or so. He swept over them like locusts and had virtually defeated all of his enemies in 325. Went as far as India, by the way. Kind of went too far there, lost a battle, came back, and died at the age of 32 years old in 325. Now, why do I talk about him? He died without a will and without an heir. So his conquered lands all over the eastern area of the Mediterranean was divided between four of his generals. A man named Ptolemy was a Greek, but he took over as the king in essence, or in Egypt, and his descendants became Ptolemy second, Ptolemy third, Ptolemy fourth, and so on. But they were really Greek. Um, and then a man named Seleucus took over in Syria, which is modern day um, Iran and Iraq and the southern area of Turkey. Now, why is that important? Because for years after 325 BC, there'll be constant wars between Egypt and Syria, and Palestine is right between them, the land of the Jews. So over and over, you have conquering armies marching up, marching down, marching up, marching down for centuries. And Palestine it takes the brunt of a lot of that. Another big thing to understand is Alexander was passionate about Greek culture, and everywhere he went, he would have Greek buildings built, and particularly temples to the Greek gods. He encouraged the Greek language all over the Mediterranean, and it became, in essence, the language of commerce. The Jews over time almost stopped speaking Hebrew and picked up a version of either Greek or a version of Aramaic, which was more like an Iranian or Persian dialect. But he spread culture, art, and Greek construction.